We finished up on the first part of our Eamon Kelly series talking about how he's eyeing up a new drugs route into Ireland from Miami. He's made contact with a guy called John Francis Conlon, who's an Irish guy living out there with connections to the Escobar network. And he's flying over and back to Miami to set this up, but he doesn't know that the Gardaí are watching him. So what happens is, on the 3rd of September in 1992, this guy Conlon arrives at Dublin Airport on a flight from Miami, along with this very large Cuban woman. The two of them part company. Conlon makes his way out to the arrivals hall alone, and she takes a taxi into the city centre, right? So it's a bit of a classic Quentin Tarantino style cluster. But the undercover Gardaí had been tailing Kelly for hours that day. They were unaware that he was meeting Conlon, but they had been watching him because they knew that this Miami deal was kind of going down. So it's the serious crime squad that has been watching him, right? So they see him park up and make his way into the arrivals, where he makes eye contact with Conlon before the two of them walk out separately, but yet get into this Renault van. So the cops are following him as he drives the car with Conlon in the passenger seat, and they first make their way to Furry Park in Killester, which is Eamon Kelly's home. And we should have mentioned that he did migrate out of the city centre to this sort of very respectable middle-class suburb.
Absolutely.
And Jerry Hutch does similar when he moves to Clontarf.
I mean, Furry Park would be one of a really exclusive address. And I think he has 9 kids in total, Eamon Kelly. So he has a very, in some ways, a very stable home life in the middle of all of this.
Mm-hmm. And the neighbours, of course, wouldn't have a clue who he was. They're a respectable family.
Yeah. I mean, to be honest, I think they would eventually know who he was anyway.
Yeah. Anyway, nonetheless, so they go first of all to Furry Park in Killester. He goes inside the house and then they hit the road again. And they're driving around various parts of Dublin. They're being tailed all the time. Eventually, Conlon gets out and goes into a bank near Pembroke Road. And subsequently, inquiries would find out that he withdrew £2,000 in cash while Kelly waited outside in the car. They get back in the car and they drive for Jury's Hotel in Bowlesbridge, where Kelly parks and Conlon gets out of the car. So he goes inside the hotel and he returns with a bag, which both of the men examine before they place it into the boot. And eventually they're driving again. They're stopped at the Eastlink toll bridge, and both of them are arrested and taken into custody. Okay, so the bag, surprisingly enough, contains a white powder, which was sent for technical examination, but officers knew it was cocaine. This wasn't a random search at all. They had the intel. So there was other evidence collected around the car, including a piece of paper that had fallen out of Conlon's shirt, and it contained the name of a Cuban woman called Elizabeth Yamanoha, right? And she's the lady who'd accompanied him on the flight and who had separated from him after they disembarked. She is picked up by officers at the hotel, at Jury's Hotel, and her room is searched. And there's more evidence there linking the three of them to this plot to import cocaine, including the bank note band with the £2,000 written on it. And there's adhesive tape that she has torn from her jumper and from her clothing, and they're covered with cocaine because in actual fact, what they had done was they had hidden the cocaine in the folds of her skin and sellotaped it to her body. So, the sting was a huge success.
Because is there a final value given on it?
The value of it will vary, but it's in and around the £500,000. It's the kilo,
And so, I mean, we have £500,000 worth of cocaine seized regularly now, or it's not that big a deal. But at the time, I think, and I can't remember this exactly, but I think that was basically the majority of the year's seizures of cocaine, because it was really, really not a drug that was on the streets of Ireland.
It was trickling in, really, wasn't it?
Trickling in.
Yeah.
I mean, what you had was, obviously by 1994, you had huge amounts of ecstasy had hit the scene in Ireland. Probably in 92, it really began, and cocaine would follow. But most of the smuggling was being done on a very non-industrial level. It was very small scale. It was people bringing back little bits themselves or posting bits back. And I think the reason that the case became so, caught the attention at the time, was because it was the first real major seizure linked to very serious criminal figures.
And like, it was seen as a huge coup for the Gardaí at the time. I mean, in charge of it was a man called Inspector Martin Callanan, who'd later go on to become the commissioner of An Garda Síochána. And they had this fleet of specially modified surveillance vans they were using. It was a huge coup because Kelly was a big target, but also those links to the IRA.
Yeah,
that were determined and would be later in court reporting. But it was a bit peculiar, and this is a little bit of a segue, but I'll tell you it anyway because it's kind of intriguing, and it shows us what's going on in those times. The moment he was caught, Kelly sort of denied point blank he had anything to do with the drugs, and he told the police that he had been asked by a friend of his called James Byrne, Beirne, by the way, to pick up Conlon. And he said Conlon told him that the bag contained money for this friend, Jim Byrne. So who's Jim Byrne, right? So he's actually an interesting character, and why Kelly was throwing him under the bus at this point is, slightly confusing. But Byrne is a former Roscommon football star who was at this point living in London and sort of courting celebrities and hanging around with a lot of high rollers, living this champagne lifestyle. He was a very sort of gregarious and popular guy. He enjoyed a bit of a flutter on the races and had a habit of going through money like water. So he had a privileged enough start to life, Byrne. He had gone into dentistry college before he dropped out and headed to London to earn his fortune in a different way, and had there kind of found himself mixing with these sort of rich socialites, etc. He was, of course, this popular sports star back home here in Ireland, but he was arrested at one point and sentenced for defrauding a Jersey bank out of 353 gold Krugerrand coins.
Right, the South African ones, yeah.
Worth the equivalent at the time of about €100,000. And he'd actually gone to jail, but when he'd come out, he'd come straight back to Ireland and set up a series of companies before embarking on another major fraud against the Norwegian government, involving this dried fish, and it was something to do with grants coming from the Norwegian government for that. So he's a really colourful character, this guy Byrne. The police are aware of him. He's one of these sort of high-end fraudsters, a fella who can set up a company very easily, etc. And he's thrown into the mix of this whole thing by Kelly, who obviously is doing it for a reason, because he's not ratting on a friend, is he? That's not his style at all. So we'll just park that there for the moment, because he does come back into the story. But Kelly and Yamanoha are remanded in custody, but Conlon is given bail.
Yeah.
And he's basically allowed out on this bond of 140,000. And despite the fact that he had to surrender his passport, he managed to get his hands on a British one somehow. And he flew back to Miami and later rang the guards and apologised for having absconded. But do bear in mind, he's working with the DEA.
Right.
So this is a little bit complex. So Kelly's furious. Yeah. He's remanded in custody. He's vehemently pleading not guilty to this. He's feeling a bit, I suppose, foolish and a bit furious that he's standing in a dock with a Cuban lady, and that Conlon has fled back to Miami. And it's also not a good look to be done for drugs, no matter what. So there's a trial, and the court hears these sort of detailed forensic tests that were done on the adhesive tapes that the woman had used to sellotape the drugs to her body. A little bit was heard about her. She'd worked in the service industry in Miami. She was very poor, and she was getting paid the $2,000 for this job. Dr. Sheila Willis, who was a forensic scientist at the time, she told the trial that samples of the tape found in the bin in the hotel room matched the fibres of on the green jumper that she wore. Yeah. I mean, Dr. Sheila Willis participated in a podcast we did recently about Noel Long.
Yeah.
It was the coldest murder case that was ever solved in the country. And, you know, again, fibres and particles, etc., were involved in her work back then. And there was plenty of other evidence as well. Now, Kelly is found guilty and he's given 14 years.
Which is, again, it probably is the timing of all of these things. It's coming at a point in which drugs have become a huge issue in a huge political and issue for the state. And there is a sense that drug dealers aren't being treated harshly enough, that there certainly through the 80s, there were these short sentences that caused a lot of public controversy. And obviously, there haven't been many big cocaine seizures coming into Ireland, and there certainly is.
No, he's the first major cocaine dealer, and his co-accused got 8 years.
Yeah,
you know, the drug mule, and probably never got paid a penny for it.
No,
you have to feel sorry for these people that are caught up in the mix of it. So before, you're going to tell us how he got on in prison and who he befriended, etc. But before we do that, and this just shows again this kind of like, you know, ability to rage against the system and the pillars of Irish society. He's sort of between the conviction and his sentence hearing, right? So it's between that time. So he's convicted, but the sentence hearing, and it is a little bit of a tricky time sometimes, and there's a jury involved and whatever. It's always a little bit of murky territory.
Yeah.
But the Irish Times published a number of articles, not only covering the evidence at the trial, but also digging into Kelly's background and his deep links with republicanism and organised crime. So it was actually then journalist Paul O'Neill, who would go on to become the Irish Times editor. And he'd focused on really the big unanswered question of that trial, which was, why were the Gardaí following Kelly in the first place?
Yes, and some of this comes back to the political connections in the official Republican movement, you know?
Mm-hmm. So, I mean, that's what he had done. And he'd done these series, you know, he'd had a number of sources, and he'd been able to put together this profile of Kelly as a violent criminal involved in fraud, drug smuggling, and somebody who is closely associated with leading criminal figures in Dublin. So if the neighbours didn't know what he was before then, they certainly, and probably were Irish Times readers.
They probably
in Leicester, in the leafy suburbs. So he sort of, you know, he's a kind of a jailhouse lawyer too, Kelly. You know, he's thinking constantly about how he can get himself around that. So he goes to court and he describes the articles as malicious and pernicious lies. And he complains to the Court of Criminal Appeal, where he argues that the articles had been prejudicial and the trial judge should have acceded to applications to discharge the jury as a result.
So, I mean, it's a complicated thing that we know well, but probably the public don't.
Maybe they don't, yes.
So, like, if a jury hear a case, say a drugs case, the jury are 12 members of the public, and you can't publish anything during a trial that will lead them to presume a bit of guilt of somebody. So you have to be very careful of the reporting. So you can't get into the background. So Eamon Kelly goes on trial in that case. You can't go in and say, and he was previously convicted in the 70s and he's a terrible reputation, because the jury are sitting. A jury then make a decision. They've listened to 6 weeks of trial. They said this guy is found guilty. Then there's a period of time, usually 2 or 3 months, and a judge will sentence. The jury doesn't have anything to do with the sentence. They just decide guilt or not. And then they're effectively done. Now, they're not totally done. The judge might thank them or whatever, but they've no more decision to make. So in that gap between when the jury have decided and the judge makes a sentencing, people tend to write more openly.
Mm-hmm.
Because
more in-depth stuff.
Yes, because a judge are professionals. The belief is they're not going to be influenced by what's in an old Sunday World article or anything else.
Yeah. So
this is the point at which he tries to attack by saying the judge is influenced by what's in the Irish Times. And it's a strategy, I think.
Yeah, and I mean, it goes back to what he did the time that he was, convicted of the assault on the 21-year-old outside the Workers' Club. He goes back and argues a bit and has it reheard.
Oh, totally. And he has.
And gets a lesser conviction.
Yes, and brings in witnesses and who said it wasn't him, it was somebody else, including his brother at some point. So yes, he throws a bit of shade on it all.
So yeah, so Kelly had sort of jumped on this and thought that this was a reason that everything had to be, parked and he should have been acquitted. It's the Late Show, amazingly, where the trial had also been discussed, was also cited by him for straying into this sort of illegal commentary area. Probably the two most careful,
exactly,
between the Late Show and the Irish Times. Anyway, so the ruling goes somewhat in Kelly's favour, but instead of throwing out the case as he had requested, the Court of Criminal Appeal simply order a new one. So Kelly goes back to the High Court, asking it to stop the second trial, claiming he couldn't get a fair hearing because of the publicity surrounding the case, but that doesn't work and he finds himself back in the dock. So all this is going on while he's in prison.
Yes. But ultimately, he gets convicted again.
I was going to say that he actually, after the second trial, he's found guilty and later sentenced to 14 years.
Which is a huge amount of time. Even back then, he's no longer a particularly young man. This is in.
But that legal agitation that it really governed trial reporting by the media for many years in the aftermath.
It did. So he goes into prison and he is put in Portlaoise in the mid-90s. And Portlaoise was built or designed particularly to hold the subversive organisations like the INLA and the IRA. But at that stage, organised criminals have become probably the biggest grouping in there. Because we had clearly had an growing organised crime problem at that stage. Kelly is one of the probably older than some, but he's put in with some of the most notorious names of Irish, the underworld history, like people like John Gilligan are in there when he's in there, Desi O'Hare, the Border Fox, Dutchy Holland, Brian Meehan would ultimately be there. There'd be also younger criminals, including Marlowe Hyland, who was only serving a very short sentence for traffic offences, but he was also put in there because of his reputation. And so what happens in prison, you hear bits, but you don't hear too much. And, that's a long period of time. But a fascinating article was published earlier this year by the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists. Now, this is a cross-border organisation that writes about crime. And one of the things they focused on is Christy Kinahan and his operation in Dubai, because that's become such an international story. But they published this article, which was a really a sort of slightly unusual one. And it's basically about how Christy Kinahan's time in Portlaoise prison and how he ran a magazine in the prison, short story writing. Oh. And they speak to a former prison officer who's on the record who talks about it. And, there's copies of it. And he writes under the name Cian Sharkin, which is an amalgam of Christy Kinahan, all those letters. And it's called Pros and Cons, as in PROSE, and cons, obviously con men. And but there's an interesting bit in it. It talks about him being on E1 landing, and it describes Christy Kinahan in prison very dapper and very careful, not making a lot of fuss, not throwing his weight around. But there's an interesting bit about who he's working with. So he's editing this, and Christy Kinahan, and it says he also edited the poetry of two of Ireland's most infamous paramilitaries turned criminals, Desi the Border Fox O'Hare and Eamon Kelly. And it describes Desi O'Hare's history. Desi O'Hare obviously had begun the IRA, ended up in the INLA, responsible for a number of deaths, and of course, famously, the kidnapping of a dentist. And he describes how O'Hare and Kelly are working on this magazine with Christy Kinahan. And it says, Desi O'Hare, this is the prison officer speaks, says, Desi O'Hare did the drawings for Pros and Cons. He was a deep character, the last person I spoke to before leaving the prison service, as he invited me in for a cup of tea. O'Hare told me that night his soul would leave prison and travel to the hills of Donegal. right? And it also describes how Eamon Kelly also worked on this magazine with Christy Kinahan, and how they're the closest to O'Hare. They were all, the three of them were hanging around together. And Kinahan, the prison officer says Kinahan and Kelly used to walk the exercise together, and that Kelly was the picture editor.
Right.
He would choose the photos for pros and cons.
Right.
And along with another man, Harry Melia, who was a former associate of the General Cahill.
Is there any of these copies of these publications?
Well, they are, and some of it is there. It's in this article. They have little screenshots of it. So they're doing kind of prose. They're also doing poetry. But what I think you see is there's
they're forming that friendship, aren't they?
They're forming that friendship. These guys are in prison. There's obviously a lot of, let's say, call them headbangers in there. Young fellas throwing their weight around. But you have this older grouping in there that where Kelly and Kinahan obviously become close, but there's others involved in it as well. And Kinahan was in there at that time. He'd come back for his father's funeral. He'd been arrested for an old case to do with travellers' checks and fraud, and had served a period of time. Put in prison for a couple of years. But you can see these are the guys that Christy Kinahan likes to deal with.
Yeah.
Older, serious, not young hotshots, which he, by all accounts, didn't like those guys brought in by his son, Daniel. And that relationship with Kinahan, I think, would go on to become very important for Kelly when he got out.
And interestingly, so, he's doing this to keep himself busy inside and building that bond and a lifelong friendship with Desi O'Hare.
Yeah.
But, while he's agitating these trials and all the rest on the outside, a couple of little key things come up. During the second trial, right?
Yeah.
A Detective Sergeant John Fitzpatrick of the Guarded Drug Squad tells Mr. Peter Charlton, prosecuting, that at that point, so we're in 92, cocaine was widely used in Ireland by more affluent sections of society. It was generally sold, he said, with a purity of between 25 and 30% arid, but the cocaine in the possession of Kelly and others had an 85% purity. He was going to change the whole landscape with this, or else bulk it.
Yeah.
To bulk it down, the purity of it rather. It was 500,000 indeed at the time. But also he goes to the Court of Criminal Appeal looking to dismiss. Now, let me just think about this. So it's 1996, right? So he's behind bars. He's forged his friendship with Christy Kinahan. He is in the Court of Criminal Appeal looking for a dismissal of a second legal challenge centred on the allegations. He takes a second legal challenge. Here we go. And this centres on allegations that the former head of the City of London CID and Fraud Squad, the then Commissioner Thomas Dickinson, had given information to the Gardaí after Kelly's arrest, he said, which would have been essential to his defence. And he says that he was the victim of a miscarriage of justice due to John Conlon's role in this whole conspiracy. He didn't win with that. It fell on deaf ears, and he had to kind of accept at this point, he'd kind of reached the end of the line, that he was, going to have to do his time. But he brings back up the Conlon connection. He's aware of that. He knows that he's a DEA agent. And it's also around this period of time that James Danger Byrne comes back into the mix, because he's caught in the UK trying to smuggle cocaine worth 6.5 million sterling into Britain. Danger's 51 at this stage. He's sort of older than the average cocaine dealer, as was his co-accused, who was in his late 50s. And he had done this deal with a Peruvian with a gang based in the Andes, and he'd ordered 50 kilos and devised, I suppose, what they believed was a foolproof plan to get it into Britain. But nonetheless, he had come a cropper. So, it didn't take Eamon Kelly to have him banged up. But he threw that name out at that point. So there must have been some sort of an argument there. If anybody's listening and knows that, it's just a little intriguing thing.
And there are obviously, he's already under surveillance, whether the guards had him under surveillance anyway. or they were under surveillance because of the cocaine. I don't think that
Because of
fully
the
becomes
information.
clear.
Yeah,
So-
it's all a little bit.
And there obviously are these international organizations, and some of this may be to do with the IRA and things like that. So it is a because that's the intersection that Eamon Kelly is operating at. Now, while he's going through this trial and going through in prison, his brother Matt Kelly, who he grew up with, who was always so close to, becomes a multimillionaire. And he becomes a multimillionaire along with Gerard Hutch, who also becomes extremely wealthy. And they become wealthy people, primarily, well, who knows exactly how, but they certainly become wealthy through property. There's a guy called Paddy Shanahan. He's nicknamed the Builder, probably because he is a builder. He's another one of these unusual figures that becomes involved in gangland, in that he didn't come from that deprived background where he was surrounded by criminality growing up. He gets involved in sort of, I think, crime more for a thrill than anything else. But as the boom starts, the building boom, the Celtic Tiger starts to kick off, he starts building homes across the North Inner City, and he gets investment from a lot of people, including Gerard Hutch and Matt Kelly, and they start making loads of money because the property market goes crazy. Paddy Shanahan ultimately would be killed in a kind of a murky gun murder.
Do you remember what year that was?
I think it was 1996 that he was killed. It's never fully been clear. Somebody may know exactly why and what happened, and it was always said that Dutchy Holland was a suspect for pulling the trigger, but hardly for ordering it. Dutchy Holland obviously was also a suspect in the murder of Veronica Guerin, but he was a hitman for hire. So they make a lot of money. The Criminal Assets Bureau, as I said before, gets set up. Initially, they start targeting John Gilligan, but Gerard Hutch and Matt Kelly quickly follow. They become prime targets. We've spoken before about how Gerard Hutch ultimately will pay over money. Matt Kelly would ultimately pay over 3 million as a kind of a tax settlement with CAB. It wasn't a proceeds of crime case brought, but in 2002, you heard this as part of the settlement, as part of the case brought, you hear this incredible property portfolio Matt Kelly has developed, including properties in Buckingham Village, where Gerard Hutch would also have apartments, but also all across the North Inner City. He comes to a deal with CAB and pays, I think it's 3 million euros at that stage, which is a huge amount of money to be able to pay off. And you heard how, for example, he is a multi-millionaire as a result of an investment in a car park in the North Inner City. So he regularizes his affairs, and at the same time, his brother, that, they'd always been worked, very, very closely. He's serving out the rest of his prison sentence in Portlaoise.
And of course, when he comes out ultimately of Portlaoise, he really cements his role as a mentor. He's met with Marlowe Hyland, obviously, in the prison. Hyland is one of the biggest players on the drug scene at this point. And Kelly goes into a almost semi-retirement of such, in that he becomes the kind of the mentor to all. And also the friendship he made with Christy Kinahan in prison is very important as well, because Kinahan is at this point in Europe. He's floating between Belgium, the Netherlands, and Spain. He's developing what will become the first proper Irish mafia on the Costa del Sol, and later an international cartel. And he's extremely powerful. But you can only get to Kinahan through Kelly.
You can only get through. So there's a group of kind of older criminals that Christy Kinahan has around him, including John Cunningham, who again would have been a real contemporary of Eamon Kelly. But Eamon Kelly's based in Dublin, and people like Marlowe Hyland, I mean, they're he really is a Kinahan franchise, isn't he? Now, Marlow Highland would get drugs off other people if there's a shortage or whatever. It's not as if he has to exclusively deal with the Kinahans. But that gang, as time goes on, the Kinahans become huge suppliers. And obviously, what Eamon Kelly, he provides that link and also the knowledge of, collections, logistics, movement of money, all of that has to be handled by somebody in the country. Christy Kinahan, while he trusts obviously his own sons, but a lot of, at this stage in particular, a lot of that is being done by these older groupings around Christy that include Eamon Kelly. Like, if you remember, at some of this time, Christy Kinahan would come back to Ireland and he'd have these kind of summits and he'd bring some of these young guys together for boxing matches or whatever. But really, I think at this point, Eamon Kelly has become a kind of a contact man for Christy in Ireland and in Dublin.
For sure. So he's at the very, very top of his game at this point. But of course, all good things come to an end. And there's a good place to leave it, part 2. And in part 3, we'll discuss that mentoring and how things go very wrong with the arrival of a very ambitious young dissident called Alan Ryan. So we'll come back for part 3 on that. I'm Nicola Tallant and you're watching Crime World, a podcast about criminals, drugs and the underworld in Ireland and across the globe. Make sure you subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you can be the first to watch all our latest episodes. You can also listen wherever you get your podcasts.